In 1917, the water was black, and the fog hung thick as smoke. In Coxon, Daniel Loomis couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Aboard USS Fanning, the Atlantic turned hostile. The United States had only just entered the war, and these waters belonged to the Kaiser and his invisible hunters. Then he saw a ripple, barely there. At first he thought it was a hair on the lens. There it was again, a faint, narrow crease rising on the surface. He shouted, "Periscope!" Every sailor's nightmare. When a U-boat periscope appeared, a torpedo usually followed. The alarm sounded. Boots thundered across the deck. Depth charges were armed. For the first time in the war, a U.S. ship had spotted the hunter before it struck. In the final months of 1916, Germany stood at a crossroads. Stalemated on the Western Front, Berlin faced a harsh truth. Conventional warfare would not win this war. Their secret weapon, the U-boat, had already devastated Allied shipping, yet Britain's vital supply routes remained open. Without decisive escalation, Germany's window for victory was closing. Grand Admiral Henning von Holtzen, chief of the Imperial Admiralty Staff, made his move on December 22, 1916. Presenting a confidential memo to the Kaiser and Field Marshal Hindenburg, he argued it was time to abandon the prize rules and unleash unrestricted submarine warfare. No warnings, no lifeboat provisions, sink every enemy vessel bound for Britain. His plan depended on numbers, sinking 600,000 tons of merchant shipping per month, sustained for 4 to 5 months, would cut British imports by roughly 40% and starve the country into surrender. Holzenhoff acknowledged that America's entry could not be avoided, yet he remained unbowed. He bluntly assured the Kaiser, "Not one American will land on the continent," believing a fast, lethal blow would end the war before U.S. troops could tip the scales. Pressure in Berlin mounted. The Chancellor warned that such a policy risked American economic retaliation, but Holzenhoff and Hindenburg were decisive. At a press conference on January 9, 1917, military leaders prevailed, and the Kaiser approved unrestricted warfare effective. February 1, 1917. At the end of January, Berlin formally informed Washington of the policy shift. By February 3, President Wilson severed diplomatic ties, and by April 6, the United States declared war. In Berlin, the mood was triumphant. Holzenhoff had set the stage for a submarine blockade on an unprecedented scale. The U-boats lurked beneath the North Atlantic engines, humming, torpedoes primed. Within weeks, they were sinking Allied shipping faster than ever. In February 1917, they sent over 500,000 GRT to the bottom, and by April, the monthly total reached a staggering 860,000 registered tons. Britain's food silos began to run low as panic swept the warehouses and docks. There was a genuine chance the island could collapse before American reinforcements arrived. The Allies were uncertain how to react. Convoys had been rejected early on as wasteful and slow. The British Admiralty refused to trust supplies to group protection. But as tonnage losses climbed above 300,000 GRT per month, urgency mounted and naval staff fought behind closed doors for immediate change. Germany moved fast. By February 1, more than 100 U-boats patrolled key shipping lanes, their commanders on high alert. Holzenhoff remained confident, even as intelligence confirmed that America was preparing troop convoys and expanding its Atlantic fleet. If Germany's U-boat offensive could seal Britain's fate by the summer of 1917, Berlin would claim victory. If not, Germany would ignite a new front powered by fresh American manpower and material. The Allies were not passive. Convoy tactics, depth charge experiments, and repositioned destroyers were already being prepared to test Holzenhoff's gamble. The next chapter, beginning in spring 1917, would decide whether unrestricted submarine warfare would break Britain or backfire. Catastrophically, the aggressive new U-boat strategy seemed to be working. Britain's green reserves shrank to just 6 weeks' supply. A little more, and the island would face starvation. Berlin pressed on, confident the blockade could collapse Britain by summer. Even as society teetered, many in Britain resisted change. The Admiralty, convinced convoys would slow deliveries and create bigger targets, stubbornly clung to an every ship for itself policy. The tide began to turn in late April 1917. Rear Admiral Alexander Duff of the Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Division urged, first, see Lord John Jellicoe to reconsider. Prime Minister David Lloyd George also pressed the case, pointing out Germany's fragile economy. Naval staff had dismissed convoys at a March meeting. But by April 27, the Admiralty relented and approved full North Atlantic convoy coverage. American naval leadership mobilized swiftly. Vice Admiral William S. Sims, newly appointed liaison in London, warned the British that U-boats would win without proper escorts. By May 1, Sims had secured Jellicoe's agreement. Within days, 12 U.S. destroyers were ordered to Europe, and by May 10, the first escorted convoy departed Gibraltar, arriving unscathed on May 22. The full transatlantic convoy system began on June 15 with a convoy leaving Hampton Roads under HMS Roxburgh, joined mid-ocean by 8 destroyers. Losses dropped immediately. Although a straggler was lost on that maiden voyage, the success silenced many naval skeptics and convoys expanded quickly. By July, over 30 U.S. destroyers were operating overseas. By May and June, a coordinated Allied defense took shape. British destroyers, armed merchant cruisers, pre-dreadnoughts and U.S. destroyers formed layered screens, while airships and observation balloons began providing aerial surveillance. Only 43 destroyers were ready, far fewer than the 75 ideally needed, but their tactical benefit was immediate. By summer 1917, the strategy had quietly reshaped the war at sea. Even with stragglers, each convoy's concentrated escort absorbed much of the U-boat threat. Sinking rates fell significantly, and by July monthly tonnage, losses never again reached April's levels. That turnaround let American destroyers such as USS Fanning and USS Nicholson move from escort duty to offensive submarine hunting. 7 miles south of Queenstown, Ireland, a periscope barely broke the surface of the North Atlantic, steel finger probing the grey water. Through its narrow lens, Captain Lieutenant Gustav Amberger watched Convoy OQ-20 emerge from the afternoon mist on November 17, 1917. For 2 days he had held U-58 along this precise route. Engines silent, the crew moving in whispers, the submarine hung between surface and deep, a 191-foot predator waiting for the perfect moment. Amberger swept the periscope across the formation. 8 merchant vessels in 4 columns, shepherded by 6 American destroyers and 2 British corvettes. The target was clear: the 5,782-ton steamship Welshman, riding low with a cargo of vital supplies. In U-58's cramped control room, the crew prepared their torpedo with practiced efficiency. 8 days into Amberger's first patrol as commander, he had already sent 1 British sailing vessel to the bottom. The Welshman would survive. U-58 had claimed 21 vessels in a year under her previous commander. She was a U-57 type submarine, commissioned on August 9, 1916, and launched that October as part of the Imperial German Navy's 2nd Flotilla. Her crew of 39 had perfected the art of the ambush and meant to keep that tradition. 400 yards away, USS Fanning rolled on the swells, her narrow hull protesting each wave. The 742-ton destroyer had been launched in 1911 for a different kind of warfare, but hasty retrofitting in Boston had equipped her with marked depth charges. 300-pound drums of TNT sailors, called Ashcons for their ungainly appearance. Under acting commander, Lieutenant Arthur Carpenter, Fanning guarded the convoy's rear port flank, her skeleton crew keeping a vigilant watch despite exhaustion from months of convoy duty. She was a ship that showed her age. Her depth charges had an alarming habit of detonating prematurely. The previous month to early explosions had damaged her generators and rattled the men. She rolled badly in heavy seas, yet the crew took fierce pride in their old destroyer, painting over rust and tending her guns with near-religious devotion. Leading the escort was USS Nicholson, Commander Frank Debeриan's O'Brien class destroyer, commissioned in April 1915, where Fanning was narrow and temperamental. Nicholson was broader and more stable. armed with 4 4-inch guns and torpedo tubes, clearly a ship built for modern warfare. Barrian, the senior officer present, had already proven himself by driving off U-62 in October, though without a confirmed sinking. The convoy had left Queenstown Harbor at 11:45 a.m., spending hours forming into columns while the escorts circled like sheepdogs organizing a flock. At 4:10 p.m., with 7 miles between them and safety, they steamed on through patchy fog and fading light. On Fanning's bridge, coxswain David Daniel Loomis rubbed his eyes and resumed scanning the horizon. His shipmates spoke of his vision with something approaching awe. One officer called it a most extraordinary set of eyes, where others saw only grey sea meeting grey sky. Loomis could pick out details invisible to normal sight. The fog thickened, visibility dropping to barely 400 yards. Spray from the bow mixed with mist, forming a shifting wall that seemed to swallow the forward escorts. Loomis swept his gaze across the water in the methodical patterns set by months of convoy duty. There it was, something wrong, not awake. A thin, dark line, perhaps 1.5 inches in diameter, protruded about 10 inches above the surface. Motionless, he shouted, "Periscope." Loomis's cry cracked across the bridge like a whip. Lieutenant Walter O. Henry, officer of the deck, reacted instantly. Left full rudder. All ahead, full. His hand slammed the general quarters alarm as Fanning's bow swung hard to port. Bells clanged and men scrambled, racing to battle stations. In U-58's control room, Amberger watched through his periscope as a destroyer materialized from the mist, bow on and closing fast. The submarine had been moving so slowly to avoid detection that it produced no wake. But that stealth had become a trap. The American was too close, coming too fast. Their only hope lay in the slender periscope. There was no way the destroyer could have seen them in this fog. Carpenter reached the bridge, took in the situation at a glance, and decided a direct ram would risk crippling his own ship. He ordered a turn to release the depth charges. A grey drum rolled off Fanning's fantail, tumbling into darker water. The crew held their breath, counting seconds. The Mark II charges were notoriously unreliable. Their hydrostatic fuses were primitive at best. The explosion came too soon, detonating barely 30 feet down, instead of the intended 50. The premature blast slammed Fanning's stern, knocking men off their feet and disabling the destroyer's generators. Emergency lighting flickered as the damage control party scrambled to assess the harm. Premature or not, the shock found its mark. U-58 shuddered, as if struck by a hammer. In the submarine's engine room, electrical panels sparked. The stern diving planes jammed, and high-pressure oil lines ruptured, spraying hot lubricant across machinery. Water began seeping through strained seams. As pressure pushed the hull beyond its limits, Amberger ordered the U-boat to go lower, away from the reach of the charges. It was a desperate gamble. U-58's test depth was 164 feet, and the boat was already wounded. The depth gauge spun past 150, 180, 280 feet, and kept climbing as the jammed planes drove them deeper. The hull groaned with sounds no submariner wanted to hear. At 250 feet, rivets began to fail, and jets of freezing seawater shot across compartments with fire hose force. Amberger shouted, "Blow all tanks. Surface. Surface." 500 yards away, Commander Barry aboard Nicholson had seen Fanning's attack. Without waiting for orders, he swung his destroyer toward the rolling water where the depth charge had exploded, intending to drop her own load. As Nicholson completed the turn, the sea erupted. U-58's conning tower burst through the surface like a breaching whale, water streaming from her damaged hull. The submarine wallowed, unable to dive or run. Nicholson's depth charge splashed into the water, almost touching the U-boat's hull. The explosion was catastrophic, lifting U-58's bow clear of the sea before she crashed back down. Inside the submarine, men were hurled against bulkheads. Lights shattered, and the few remaining electrical systems died. The destroyer crews, hardly believing they had a U-boat at their mercy, froze for a heartbeat before opening fire. Both ships fired simultaneously, 3-inch shells from Fanning's stern gun and then 4-inch rounds from Nicholson's bow mounts. Waterspouts erupted around the sub as gunners found their range. After 3 salvos from each ship, there was movement on U-58's deck hatches clanged open and men poured out. Hands raised high, some waving white clothing or anything that might signal surrender. The guns fell silent. The engagement had lasted exactly 15 minutes. Fanning approached cautiously. Guns still trained on the submarine, and Carpenter ordered lines prepared to take her in tow. As his destroyer drew alongside, he could see water already washing over U-58's deck. The Germans were scuttling their boat. Amberger gave his final order: open the seacocks, flood the ballast tanks, and deny the enemy their prize. The crew executed with grim efficiency. U-58 began settling rapidly, her deck awash as men scrambled to abandon ship. They leaped into the North Atlantic, gasping as the freezing water hit. November in those latitudes meant temperatures that could kill in minutes. Some submariners became entangled in the radio antenna and were dragged under as the boat settled. Fanning's crew threw lines to the struggling Germans, but numb hands could not grip the ropes. Men who had survived depth charges and shellfire now faced drowning yards from salvation. Chief Pharmacist's mate Eleazar Harwell looked at the struggling men, then at coxswain Francis G. Connor. No words were needed. Both stripped off their jackets and dove into the icy Atlantic. The shock of the cold water hit them like a punch to the chest. They swam to the nearest Germans, securing lines around them so shipmates could haul them aboard. One by one, 38 Germans were pulled from the water. Fanning's crew wrapped them in blankets, gave them hot coffee, and treated their injuries. 2 were beyond help. Chief Engineer Franz Glender, exhausted from trying to save his submarine, slipped beneath the surface before rescuers could reach him. Another sailor, hauled aboard alive, suffered a heart attack on Fanning's deck. His body could not cope with the shock. U-58 made her final dive slowly, almost gracefully. Her bow rose as the stern flooded, propellers breaking the surface one last time before she slid backward into the depths. The journey back to Queenstown was subdued. German prisoners huddled in Fanning's mess decks, some still shaking from cold and shock. American sailors brought them dry clothes and cigarettes. When Fanning's boat came alongside the dock at Queenstown, something extraordinary happened. As the German prisoners prepared to disembark, they suddenly broke into applause, its voices rising in 3 cheers for their captors. A spontaneous gesture that caught everyone by surprise. Amberger, maintaining his dignity despite defeat, formally thanked Carpenter for the treatment his men had received, saying, "Much better than expected." 2 days later, Carpenter took Fanning back to sea with a somber duty. Chief Engineer Franz Glender's body, sewn in canvas with a weight on his feet, lay on a plank beneath the German naval ensign. The crew assembled on deck while Carpenter read the burial service as former enemies stood at attention. The plank tilted, and Glender slid into the sea he had sailed beneath. Buried with the same honors afforded any sailor. Vice Admiral Sir Lewis Bailey himself came aboard when Fanning returned, bringing congratulatory messages from the British Admiralty. Captain Joel Pringle, Chief of Staff for U.S. destroyers in European waters, delivered similar cables from Admiral William Benson and Vice Admiral Sims. Awards followed: the Navy Cross for Lieutenant Henry and Coxswain Loomis, whose extraordinary eyes had saved the convoy, and Distinguished Service. Medals for Commander Barrion and Lieutenant Carpenter. The greatest honor was simpler: permission to paint a star on Fanning's funnel, marking the first confirmed U-boat sinking by a U.S. Navy destroyer. U-58 represented more than a single victory. She became a tactical blueprint that validated the Allies' new aggressive approach to the war at sea. After-action reports from Fanning and Nicholson were circulated across the fleet, transforming anti-submarine doctrine almost overnight. Lookouts were retrained to spot the faintest hint of a periscope, not just torpedo wakes. Depth charge drills grew systematic and relentless. The engagement proved destroyers could be more than passive shepherds. They could be hunters, turning U-boat hunting grounds into traps. That offensive mindset, scaled across the Atlantic convoy system, yielded staggering results. Of nearly 9,000 ships that sailed and escorted convoys by the end of 1917, only 27 were lost, loss rate under 0.3%, compared with over 7% for independently sailing ships. The Allies had found the antidote to Germany's invisible hunters. For the Imperial German Navy, the consequences were devastating. U-boat losses mounted 61 submarines, lost in 1917 and even more in 1918. An unsustainable attrition rate for their elite crews. Reports from captured sailors and naval intelligence spoke of rising dread and flagging morale within the U-boat flotillas. The strategy meant to starve Britain was instead bleeding Germany's submarine force dry. In a final irony, the failure of lone wolf attacks pushed German commanders to experiment with group tactics, planting the seeds of the Wolfpack strategy that would re-emerge 2 decades later.